1970s Great Britain. Although the 70s couldn't compare to the swinging 60s, it was attempting to give it a run for its money. But the great in Britain was beginning to slip. Massive union strikes, electricity blackouts not seen since World War II, domestic abuse, racial tensions, the RIA. But hell, at least they had good weather.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony.
And still, there was a new freedom in the air that lacked in the stodgy 60s. Women were pushing for their rights, and teens were just up and leaving their homes in droves, tired of the militant parental rules that had locked them down. And every time a parent phoned and said their kid was missing, the police just filed it under who cares. After all, this was the era of self-discovery. And it was during this tumultuous time that one of the country's most infamous crimes was happening right under everyone's noses.
An estimated 6.1 per 100,000 of the general world population will be murdered this year. What makes a killer?
Is it a trait that we all share as sentient beings?
Or is it something unique to the individual? Brought on by nurturing inner rage. We live in a time where lies and manipulation are the dueling blades of the day, where life is cheap, a commodity. Welcome to DEADBUG's Diagnosis to Murder with your host, DEADBUG, with co-host, forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Shaham Das.
Murder is a terrible thing, no matter what the motive. But when the motive becomes sexual, there's almost an extra level of pain it causes to the loved ones, knowing such a violation has been provocated on someone near and dear to them. And when it's a male and a female operating as a team, with the female in a position of trust, luring in the victim, it only adds to the level of depravity. On this episode of Diagnosis to Murder, with the assistance of my esteemed co-host, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Shaham Das, we will review, then analyze the case of Fred and Rose West, a couple whose depravity knew no boundaries, not only torturing, raping, and murdering strangers, but eventually focusing that evil upon their own children. Complex characters or not, what better way to break them down than with the assistance of the good doctor.
Hello cool world, my name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist based in London in the UK. I assess mentally disordered offenders, sometimes in courts, in prisons and in locked psychiatric units. And also I work as an expert witness, which means that I give professional evidence in courts during criminal trials, including murder trials. If you're interested in this kind of area, you should definitely go and check out my YouTube channel, Psych for Sore Minds. I dissect a smorgasbord of topics related to criminality and mental illness and the crossover between the two.
Okay, Dr. Das, I know you charge by the minute, so let's not waste any time with pleasantries, and let's get into this.
Who's that? DEADBUG! Oh, I thought it was you. How you doing, my man? What case are we covering today?
You're a funny guy. Now, although I know you've heard of this case, I'll refresh your memory, because you look a little too young to remember. Frederick West was born into a loving family, but by all accounts, it was a little too loving, if you get my drift. And I ain't asking. Hey, Fred, rocking the camel toe. Fred's father was a reputed child molester, and by all accounts, he wasn't ashamed of it. And when Fred became of age, his mother got in on the action, and the two became lovers. But when he wasn't getting balls deep in his mother, he was raping his sister, getting her pregnant when she was only 13. And it's unclear whether it was because he was born into it, or because of an IQ just under 80. But either way, he was a willing participant. It was at 15 that Fred saved and bought a motorcycle, but that motorcycle would be the first step down a pathway to darkness. Because one afternoon, while racing down the country lanes, he hit a young girl. And although it hasn't been recorded what happened to the girl, West was seriously injured, with his once good looks smashed to a pulp and a head injury that left him with permanent brain damage, with his limb almost torn off, leaving him a semi-leg mental. The left leg being almost 5 inches shorter than the other one, he had to wear a cripple boot to balance himself out, making him look like the president of the KISS fan club. But the accident also changed how he was received by the opposite sex. Now with a grotesque face and pronounced limp, getting girls wasn't so easy, and he now took by force, raping several girls in the village. I guess they weren't fans of KISS, but I also guess the gimp leg didn't hinder him too much because he married a young prostitute who'd been banged up by a Pakistani bus driver, and he raised the kid as his own, having their own child shortly afterwards. But the union didn't last long and she went back to Scotland. After several failed attempts to reconcile, Fred eventually murdered the young woman along with her illegitimate child, but not before he murdered his nanny, Anne McFall, along with her 8-month unborn child he'd fathered. Rosemary Letts, on the other hand, well, she was born into this world with her own set of problems. Considered semi-retarded, almost from birth, she was regularly sexually abused by her father, who suffered from schizophrenia. Bullied, pushed around, and I guess by the time she met Fred shortly after her 15th birthday, she was looking for a way out. 13 years his junior, she was impressionable, but not for long. And the student soon became the teacher, and they both had an interest in depravity. And getting knocked up, it didn't slow her down. And that depravity involved cruising for young girls, raping them, torturing them, and then killing them. And when that didn't feed their hunger, they opened a rooming house so they could get a steady supply of meat, with Fred prostituting out his wife to the West Indian community to supplement his meager income. And he drilled a hole in his wall and watched while half the community drilled her. And they had 8 kids born into a torturous life. 5 were Fred's, 3 were from Rose's clients. Can you guess which ones? And eventually Fred and Rose turned the depravity on them. It seemed half the town knew that there were bodies buried in the couple's backyard. They only had to wait till the cops caught on. And when their daughter Heather went missing, it wasn't long before the cops showed up with diggers at their door. But Fred wasn't one to take responsibility and took his life before the trial, leaving Rose holding the bag. Okay, Shaham, let's just jump into this because I know you're a busy man and time is money. Now, Fred West came from a rural background, quite insular, dare I say inbred. Wide open spaces meant he had freedom, but it also was a brutal landscape. He regularly watched his mother clubbing to death rabbits, shooting rats, he even enjoyed bestiality. What sort of person would this have made him?
So, in terms of him living in a rural area in the countryside, I suppose you could at a stretch argue that that might have affected his social skills to a degree, less people to interact with. He also had a low IQ, as we'll come on to, so all of these things in combination might have made him a bit more of an average loner than the average person, a bit more marginalised maybe, but to me that it wouldn't have caused or even explained his murderous behaviour and his promiscuity. So I think that's, at best, it's a very weak contributory factor rather than a causative factor. Having said that, it was an environment where he could practice violence against animals, which he allegedly did.
Growing up, Fred was sexualized by his mother. She had him playing sex games with her, and apparently, by the time he was 14, they were regularly having full-blown sex. And his father was a reputed pedophile and unashamed of it. Now this must have affected him adversely in child development and his attitudes towards sex and male-female interaction.
So I think you've hit the nail on the head with this. I think that him being sexualized by his mother is a huge factor, probably the most significant factor for Fred West. Because when you go through experiences like that, when you're being, sexually abused by your own parents, in your head, you're conflating affection, love, and sex. So it would feel normal for you to want to have sex with anybody just because you want to show them affection or you're attracted to them. So what I'm saying is the usual social and normal boundaries of what is acceptable will be warped in your mind. And I think also he would have learned that consent is irrelevant because he didn't get consent from his own mother because he was too young to give it at some point. Only his desires, his sexual desires matter. And I think that's reflected in Fred West's earlier behaviour. I'm talking about the early years where he was a bit handsy, he was a bit gropey with females in his areas, let alone what he eventually did. I'm talking about the assaults and the murders. So I think another mechanism is there might be a lot of internal anger that would been built up within Fred, but he was too emotionally enmeshed with his parents to use them as the target of this anger, even though that is where the anger should have been presented. So instead he's taken it out to other people and to random strangers, for example.
Now, as you've just seen in the overview, West was in a serious road accident when he was 17 years old that left him with brain trauma, facial injuries, and a partial leg mental. One of his legs was shorter than the other, so he walked with a pronounced limp. And he was once considered the Don Juan of the village, very attractive to the girls. How would this have affected his general character?
We know that Fred was obsessed with sex, even as a child, so he would make sexually inappropriate comments, not surprising considering the abuse he suffered. We also know that he was relatively charming, he was good looking, so what I'm saying is potentially he had the tools to be successful in the romantic field. Then he has this motorbike accident, he loses his looks, which could be one of the factors to make him even more forceful and entitled sexually. So I don't think it caused it, I think it was already there, but it might have accelerated the process.
Or he might just have thought, hey, I'm ugly now, I got a gimp leg, I'm wearing a kiss boot, and I'm in no mood for romance.
But the average person who's ugly doesn't feel criminogenic, isn't entitled to sex. So again, I think it is because of his background of sexual abuse that all of this happened. The head injury, the uglification because the accident, the low IQ, these are just small contributory factors.
West's first marriage was to a prostitute named Rena Costello, who by chance he eventually went and murdered. Now, being married to a hooker, did this shape his views in the future of women? Or were these views already well established, almost a Madonna and a whore thing?
So for me, when I'm talking about his first marriage to a sex worker, I think he already at that point in his life saw women as objects, as things to just fulfill his sexual desires. I say this because his experiences of sexual abuse happened to him when he was much younger, and as I said before, his behaviour already showed since he was a child that he had very warped sexual boundaries. So again, I think he conflated affection, love and sex together even before this marriage. So in his head, all of affection and all of attraction is kind of tied up into sex, possibly even rough sex. So that's how he conceptualizes the whole thing.
It's documented that this Rena was the only woman that Fred couldn't control.
Fred was very much manipulative, so he was very good at exploiting other people, including his first wife. I mention these things because they are typical traits of a psychopath.
Rose West had a similar troubled upbringing to Fred. She was sexually abused early on by her father, and her father would let the uncle have a go. And she continued to have sex with her father even when she was married to Fred, and Fred would watch and apparently jerk off watching him. So what's the buzz here, Doc? What are these two individuals getting out of these behavioral patterns? Was it just depraved sex? Or did it all come down to the similar abuse that they'd suffered and a kinship related to that abuse?
So when we think about Rose's background experiences and them being very similar to Fred's, it's not a coincidence, I don't think. Well, it's a coincidence they found each other, but it's not a coincidence that their behaviour escalated and they broke all these taboos and boundaries. So I think they would have bonded to a degree over their shared experience. Because think about it this way, surely they both must have had many potential romantic partners before they met each other, especially Fred.
Well, she was only 15 when she met Fred, and I know there was the dad and her uncle, but I'm not sure if there's any record of her being promiscuous.
But they didn't sort of click or go into this world of torturing and of abusing and killing other people until they met each other. So I imagine they must have given off this kind of disturbed, depraved vibe to each other, both in terms of their moral sort of compass and sexually. And I think they must have been attracted to that part of each other's personality, as well as being attracted to each other physically. So I don't know whether Fred and West ever discussed their previous upbringing, if they ever talked about the abuse they suffered, but I still think they definitely would have felt some kind of like connection or some kind of kinship, even if it was subconscious. And I would just stress that it's very, very unusual for two people of this kind of similar background to actually meet each other.
Now, Doc, as you know from the notes that I sent you, Rose was semi-retarded. Now, some people might not like me saying that, but that's her classification at the time. And Fred had an IQ of 80, and experts say that was being generous. Now, would this condition have in any way hindered a moral compass that most of us would have.
I think there is a connection, but I think it's a loose connection between having a low IQ and offending, especially violently.
Well, you think it would be strong, because to adhere to any written or unwritten rules of morality, you have to fully understand them.
So people with a low IQ, often they don't understand or they don't care about social norms or boundaries or the law. And on top of that, they might feel inferior because they're just not as intelligent, they're not as sharp as people around them, they won't get jokes, they might be the butt of people's jokes. And so sometimes they harness this anger and they lash out in the only way they know how, which is violence. So just to be crystal clear, I'm not saying that low IQ in itself would damage one's moral compass, but I think, as in this case of Fred and Rose, on the background of being abused, it could warp it.
West murdered his 18-year-old nanny, Anne McFall, in 1967, who was 8 months pregnant with his baby, and this is while he was still with Rena. Stabbing her to death, cutting her up, putting her in a suitcase, and taking her out and burying her in a field somewhere. Now, he would later describe her as the love of his life. Would he have killed again unless he met Rose?
I mean, it's a degree of speculation, but I'm fairly confident that Fred would have killed again even if he hadn't met Rose. Because he did just so many killings for so little provocation or reason, or just because, impulsively on a sexual whim. And, more importantly, he seemed completely indifferent, a massive lack of empathy and remorse for any of his actions. So often killers, even serial killers, they have this pent-up rage or sexual frustration, and then when it comes out, when it's discharged in a killing, they usually feel some degree of remorse. Even those that go on to kill again, they have some degree of internal moral kind of battle or dilemma. But Fred, he seemed completely emotionally detached. So I think that it's likely he would have killed again. Maybe not as prolifically, but he would have done it again. Another massive factor we've not talked about is that they kind of got away with it. So there was very legal consequences of the actions. So I think by constantly getting away with it, that would have emboldened them both to continue with this debauched behavior.
Now I want to talk a bit about the power balance between Fred and Rose. When they met, she was 15 and impressionable, but do you think as she found herself and got more confident, this would have shifted in her favor? And do you think any of this relationship would have been shaped by the relationship and the dynamics between him and his mother?
In terms of the power balance of couples, it very much depends on the couple. So who's got the dominating personality, who's got the charm, versus who's like the naturally passive one. So that's kind of ingrained in your personality. The one thing I would say is that the power dynamic is very rare for it to change over time. And when it does, it's usually because something major has changed in the couple. So, for example, the status of one of the members has changed or has increased.
You see, I find that very interesting because from a layman's point of view, I would have thought that she would have eventually become the more dominant of the two.
What I think happens is that often the dynamic within a couple within a partnership is kind of copied or modeled from what happened with their parents. So what I'm saying is Fred might have been looking for a woman to control him, even subconsciously. And in fact, we see this with one of his wives, one of his previous partners, Rena, who is very much like a domineering mother figure. I don't think that's a coincidence.
Now, although an early example, Fred and Rose are by no means the only killer couple. They're the Moores murderers, Paul and Carla Homolka, Gwendolyn Graham and Kathy Wood, aka the Lethal Lovers, Charles Starkweather and Carol Ann Fugate. Is there a common trait or a link that all of these deadly duos share?
Common traits within the duos? Well, yeah, there are similar traits. There's, massive lack of empathy, low tolerance to frustration, low threshold to like discharge violence, lack of remorse, being impulsive, being callous. But I would argue that that's kind of present for all killers or all violent people, not necessarily just the couple. So what I'm saying is that's more to do with the killing rather than the dynamism between the couples. What I think more interesting is the relationship, the dynamic. So I think that most individuals must know on some level that their innermost murderous impulses are socially unacceptable, right? So if they finally find a romantic partner who shares their very kind of loose morals and their bloodlust, then firstly, that's extremely rare. Especially back in the day, we're talking in a day before the internet, before you have all these like disturbed forums, like for example, internet forums where you can find other people with a similar mindset on the internet. Back in those days, back in my day, they had to literally rely on people they bumped into in the local community. So the chances of two people with that kind of same perverse outlook meeting is very, very low. So I'm sure they would have all connected with their various partners.
Now, the fact that there's so little empathy shown to the victims, i.e. they tortured them and slowly killed them, does that, and I'm bringing it back to this, but does it come down to IQ?
I don't think it's really that much to do with the IQ. I've got to be honest with you, DEADBUG. As I said before, I think that's maybe a weak causative or contributory factor, I should say. I think it's much more likely to be connected to them both being victims of abuse themselves within their childhood. So as I said, low IQ, maybe struggle to understand some social norms, maybe lack cognitive empathy, but being the victim of abuse is by far a more important characteristic.
Now, Cromwell Street, where they lived and the majority of their crimes took place, they had a torture chamber in the basement with peepholes in the bedroom and the toilets as well, with Fred turning the house into a brothel, prostituting Rose out while he videoed it and got off from it. Who would have gained the most from this? Did fear play any part in this union, or was it equally rewarding?
Who benefited more? It's quite hard to answer that question because there's so many mixed up and confused emotions. So it's hard to say who gained more. The whole reward system is warped between the two of these compared to normal humans. As I was saying before, the way they view sex, emotion, affection is just twisted, it's just warped. So I think they both benefited in their own depraved way. I think they both benefited financially if they used the place as a brothel. What were the motivating factors? I absolutely think pure lust and debauchery is part of it, as well as coupled with a lack of understanding of sexual boundaries from the abuse. But also another element that often gets forgotten is maybe there was an element of fear towards each other because they were so quick to discharge violence and they were so callously and so effortlessly killing other people that I'm sure to a degree each one of them must have realised there's a potential for them to be the next victim of their partner. So to prevent that, they would have to match their partner's murderous acts. So I'm not saying they didn't enjoy it, I think they did enjoy it, but they almost couldn't give up that level of deprivation of murder because if they did, they might be seen weak by their partner and they might be the next victim. Dun, dun, dun.
By the 80s, Fred and Rose had stopped killing for 7 years, with the exception of the daughter Heather, who they killed in '87 because she was effectively having a nervous breakdown and telling anyone who'd listen of the abuse. So they killed her to shut her up. Now, was this a latency period? Or do you think the couple had effectively stopped killing? For me, I would have thought they just stopped killing.
So in terms of the latency period, I think there's a couple of possibilities. I mean, one, dare I say it, this is a bit unpalatable, but it's very possibly true, is there could have been far more killings within that interim period, but we, the public, just don't know about them. Or it's feasible they could have had a latency period. I mean, the killings were relatively impulsive, they were relatively opportunistic, so perhaps they just didn't find a suitable victim within that period. Or another alternative would be that their sexual deviancy was, their urges were fulfilled by all the other things they were doing, the orgies, etc. So that could have contained their bloodlust for a few years until it resurfaced.
As you know, Fred West killed himself in prison, effectively ending us ever really finding out the whole story of what happened in these crimes. Was this in line of him refusing to take ownership of his own actions and the repercussions of those actions? Because it seems to be a general running theme in his life.
I think it was just the reality of his future setting in. So it took a while for it to absorb his psyche. So he finally understood that the lack of freedom that he'll have in prison, obviously, but probably more than that, he would have been victimized, he'd have been targeted by other prisoners because of what he did. So he's probably facing a lifetime threat or violence. Plus, on top of all of that, we know he's got these inbuilt deep sexual perversions and he obviously can no longer fulfill them now he's in prison. So I think he's just looking at a bleak, boring life where he's never going to leave prison, might be beaten up, and he just thought, you know what, I ain't into that, let's end it, fam.
With Fred gone, it was Rose alone who took the wrath of society. But it was during the trial, while continuing to say that it was all Fred, and that she was abused and also a victim, that it was in direct contrast to her behavior, which was quite cold, indignant, and several times during the trial she mocked the victims. Now, could this have been down to the simple fact that she was a simpleton, and that there were no malice of intent of her actions?
Rose's lack of emotion, I think low IQ probably contributed to it, but I think she just generally had this huge lack of empathy or concern about any other individuals. And again, I know I keep repeating myself, but it goes back to her childhood. She was, apart from the abuse, she was never taught appropriate social behaviour. She never learnt how to develop empathy. She never experienced affection, love, support, concern from her parents. And when she did get affection, it was in a very warped form of sexual abuse in itself. So yeah, so I think those things, her upbringing and her lack of development of normal morality, is more relevant than her low IQ.
Now this is my final question, Doctor, because I know the meter's running and you probably got to go out with your buddies and have one of those chai lattes in a glass mug. But in closing, was this couple the perfect storm? A folie à deux, as they say? That's French in case you're wondering, deux means two. But would this couple have gone on to kill again separately?
Okay, sorry to get technical on your punk-ass DEADBUG, but I'm afraid I do have an issue with this term folie à deux.
Punk-ass? Jesus, that's a bit unprofessional.
So folie à deux is often misunderstood. It's a very rare psychiatric diagnosis, and it's a shared psychosis. So psychosis is stepping out of reality, usually in the form of hallucinations, delusions, so hearing voices, paranoid beliefs. So for example, if Fred, hypothetically speaking, had these beliefs that his victims were going to kill him somehow and he had to, rape and torture them to prevent his own self from dying, or if he heard voices from the devil telling him to do it and he felt compelled to listen, then he might have been psychotic. And if Rose got those exact same symptoms, which is rare but it does happen, that would have been folie à deux. What we're seeing now, with respect, Mr. Bug, is not folie à deux. They are sharing something, but it's more their horrendous kind of criminal attitudes and lack of morality rather than a psychosis.
Okay.
So it's their moral ideas and their outlooks that they're sharing, not psychiatric symptoms. So could they have prolifically killed separately? I think they would have killed separately, yeah, but maybe nowhere near as prolifically, in my opinion. I think the fact that they were together, they almost gave each other permission to act out these violent sexual fantasies. They would have passively or even directly encouraged each other. And as I said before, I think there was an element of fear for them to keep up their acts. Because in any other situation, say if they hadn't met the partners they met, say if they met other partners, they probably would have had to hide their actions and intentions and behaviours. So they might still have gone out and committed these kinds of murders, but it would be much harder to do because they'd have to hide it from their police, the public and their partners, as opposed to being able to be kind of in it together, conspiring.
Well, thank you, Doctor. I enjoyed that immensely, except for that whole thing about my punk ass, which has made me reevaluate myself as a man and my intimate relationships with others. Which we can talk about later offline if you're willing to give me some free consultation.
That's it. That's my thoughts on the West. Hope you find that educational and enjoyable. Go chickadee, check out my videos on my YouTube channel, The Psych for Sore Minds. In terms of recent videos, I've done an analysis of Alex Belfield, huge case in the UK. You probably know what I'm talking about if you're from here. And I've done a video exploring the mindset of incels, involuntary celibates, plus some of the mass murders that they've inspired. Just a quick shout out to my homeboy DEADBUG. Thank you again for the opportunity for collaboration. Love your work, love your editing. Let's do it again sometime. Until next time, peace, stay euthymic, and do not forget, I love you.
Once again, I would like to thank the doctor for sparing us his expensive time, and please go check out his channel. And this, of course, now will be a regular series. If there's things you'd like us to cover, please bring it up. And until then, this is DEADBUG's punk ass saying I'm out of here. And we'll see you on the next episode of Diagnosis to Murder.